Hello everyone, how are you doing? So this is the corset that I spent 6 months in the making, and today I'm going to show you the process of how I make it. This is my initial sketch of the corset, and I am starting with the making of tulle to create a corset pattern on the dress form to see how it looks like before actually making the actual piece. And because this design is symmetrical, so I only made one side of the tulle and will later flip the pattern to create other side of the pattern. This corset has 3 layers altogether, and the first layer is the structural layer. For structural layer, I use cotton canvas to create this layer. Cotton canvas is a type of fabric that provides strength while still remaining breathable. And after basting along the corset pattern outline, that was when I start attaching each panel together. And now it's time for the boning channels. I use cotton gross grain tape for the boning channels because it is strong, stable, and has a very little stretch. And since cotton is a natural fiber, so it can shrink slightly after washing, so I pre-washed the gross grain ribbon beforehand to make sure that it will remain stable on the corset over time. Small details like this are often invisible in the finished garment, but it will help contributing to the longevity and the quality of the piece. And now it's time to attach the cotton gross grain tape onto each corset seam allowance before sewing it down to create channels ready for the boning later on. For boning, I choose to use spiral steel boning because it is the type of boning that can bend in every direction, left, right, forward, and backward. Therefore, it provides support while still allowing the body to move naturally because it curves along the body line of the person wearing it, so that it still has the certain sense of comfort even it is a corset. After I cut each boning to the length that fits the corset pattern, then I sanded both ends with sandpaper to make the edge smoother. After that, I put caps on both ends of the boning and squeezed them with pliers to lock them in place. Then I inserted each boning into the boning channels that I sewed on previously on the corset structural layer. And then I used gross grain tape to make a waist stay because the waist area is the area that experiences the most tension when the corset is worn and pulled tight with lacing. So this waist stay will help to relieve some of that stress and tension placed on the main corset during wearing. Then it's time for the second layer of the corset, which is the batting. I started by cutting the corset pattern but without a seam allowance this time because I want it to be slightly smaller than the actual pattern so that it can fit neatly into each corset panel later on. Then I put the structural corset layer on the dress form. And then I start placing the batting onto the corset. As you can see, the batting naturally sticks to the structural layer of the corset without any pins, so I leave it on the dress form just like that to allow both the structural layer and the batting layer to begin to shape themselves onto the shape of the dress form. Then it's time for the main layer of the corset. For this layer, I use a reclaimed material which is polyester satin. Then I just repeat the same process of creating the corset pattern and sewing each panel together. And finally, it's time for the embroidery. I start by hand cutting organza into the shape of petals and burning the edges slightly to help prevent the organza from fraying. I use both white and pastel pink organza to create a more blended effect within the embroidery work. Then I started preparing the embroidery base with layers of organza and calico to help stabilize the embroidery and make it more skilled. I baste it in place to prepare for the embroidery embellishment later on. In Thai culture, there is a flower arrangement called Malai, which is the traditional Thai flower garland. When I was young, my mom would show me how to make it using jasmine leaves that we found around our neighborhood, and she would cut the jasmine leaves in half and then put them in the needle, which is quite similar to the technique that I am using now with the organza petal. After finishing the embroidered petals, I started attaching pearls and different types of beads onto the embroidery. As you can see here, I use tulle as the first surface of embroidery to help mute the glossiness of the satin fabric and create more contrast between the satin and the beads, so that it can create a bit of an illusion of floating beads on the body of the corset. The beads are denser along the edge of the petal and gradually fade towards the center of the petals to create the gradient effect of the beads. Then I sprinkle a pinch of beads onto the embroidery surface and use gravity to create a more natural pattern of bead placement. After finishing the embroidery, I take the embroidery piece out of the embroidery frame. Then I use scissors to separate each petal from each other. The embroidery process is actually the process that I spent the most of my time with, and I started to realize how time consuming it was when I was about 25% into the process. At some point, I even tried to move my body faster, aiming to finish it faster. But at the end of the day, I realized that I can only do one by one anyway. Like I can embroidery one bead at a time, one petal at a time, so there is no point in rushing it. And actually embroidery is quite a meditative task to do because it's not really challenging but rather than repetitive, so it's a great time to spend time with yourself, with your mind, to be able to sit with myself and observe myself each day, how different I am on each day. In Thai, we call it samadhi, which is like meditation, concentration. It is the state that occurs naturally when you focus on something continuously over the same object of attention. After that, I started assembling all the layers of the corset together, beginning by attaching the batting layer onto the structural corset layer, before putting the main fabric layer onto the outer surface. As you can see here, I use light pink organza underneath to create a subtle tint so that the contrast between the off-white and pink is not too strong. And it also helps creating smoother transition between the embroidery part and the corset. Then I ironed the seam allowances open. And then I trimmed away the fraying from the seam before using a catch stitch to secure the seam allowances to keep them lying open evenly. Then after that, I attach all the corset layers together to combine them into one piece. And now is my favorite time, which is putting all of the embroidery details onto the corset. I pinned the embroidered petals lightly onto the dress form first to see how they look like. After every petal is placed, then I take the corset off the dress form and start attaching each petal onto the corset. I also use invisible stitches or slip stitches to create the illusion of the flower that is starting to bloom. Some areas remain flat, other areas begin to lift away from the corset body. Everything nowadays can be done so perfectly, and I think to leave the little details that I call the perfect imperfection in the appropriate place. Of course, it can consider as like a charm of the human craftsmanship as well. It's just like in the nature, you know, you will never find exactly the same shape, the same detail of flower petals, and that in itself is the perfect imperfection that designed by the intelligence of nature that remind us of something when we got to contemplating on it. And after that, I start setting the grommets onto the corset panels. And all of the fabric that I use for this piece is actually made from reclaimed material, apart from the part that requires a specific material like channel boning or structural layer that requires specific material for the corset. But other than that, the main part, the petals, the lining, all made from reclaimed fabric, which initially it likely comes from scrap of fabric, right? So this design itself is quite suitable to do because if you look at the detail, the design closely is like the small element that gathering together into one design. So it's quite suitable for the scrap of fabric to do. And another thing that I find quite rewarding during the process of making this corset is that how little of the waste that I got to throw it away, because this corset was making from something that considered as waste from the start anyway, and each detail is quite small. If I have a little piece of organza left, I can still cut it into the petal and use it for the embroidery. So it's something that is very rewarding to have so little of the waste left to throw away. And this is the finished embroidered petal corset. Initially, I didn't think at all that this corset would take this much time to do, and there were a lot of time that I questioned myself that it might be the project that was too ambitious for me to do it alone by myself. But abandoning or giving this corset up is not an option for me. I have a rule for myself that everything I start, I have to finish, because a lot of time you can learn what you need to learn by going through the whole process from start to finish. Otherwise, I will never know that the reason that I don't want to do it anymore because I genuinely did not enjoy it anymore, or I just want to avoid the difficult thing during the process. To be honest, I don't have much of an experience in the garment making, especially in the design that contains some complexity like this design. Is something that I learn as I go. But one of the things that is definitely incredibly rewarding is that this corset is the vision that I have in my mind 6 months ago, and then I sketched it on the paper, and now I finally have turned this into the reality.